This is the theBreaker.news podcast for the week of May 4th, 2025. I'm Bob Mackin, publisher of theBreaker.news and host of the theBreaker.news podcast. Welcome to edition number 394, and may the 4th be with you. The Breaker is your source for news, opinion, and analysis about British Columbia issues, institutions, and influencers. Later, I'll tell you how you can support The Breaker. On this edition, headlines from the Pacific Rim and the Pacific Northwest. I award a virtual Nanaimo bar to a difference maker. And on the Big Deal feature, two guests join me to discuss winners and losers of Canada's April 28th election. First, Daniel Westlake from the University of Saskatchewan on why the NDP collapsed. What is next for the party? Where did all the Labour voters go? Then, joining me from London, greenwashing whistleblower Desiree Fixler. Fixler tells me why Canadian taxpayers should be worried about a net zero technocrat in the Prime Minister's office. Will Mark Carney continue Justin Trudeau's liberal economic agenda? This is the Big Deal feature on the theBreaker.news podcast.
I have a question. Who's ready? Who's ready? Who's ready to stand up for Canada with me? And who's ready? Who's ready to build Canada strong? Okay, we got that settled. That's good.
We denied the NDP and Liberals enough seats to form a coalition government, meaning and we did all of this in a very difficult environment. That said, we are cognizant of the fact that we didn't quite get over the finish line yet. We know that change is needed, but change is hard to come by. It takes time. It takes work. And that's why we have to learn the lessons of tonight so that we can have an even better result the next time the Canadians decide the future for the country.
Tonight, I've been forward a party leader that I'll be stepping down as party leader as soon as an interim leader can be appointed. Now, I could not have done this incredible job without, here's a point, give me a second to break down a bit. I couldn't have done it without the incredible support of my wife could have given.
Those are the sounds of Liberal Prime Minister Mark Carney, Conservative Opposition Leader Pierre Poilievre, and NDP Leader Jagmeet Singh on election night. As you heard, the NDP is looking for a new leader after hitting rock bottom with just 7 seats. On April 28th, many NDP voters switched to the Liberals, and their leader, a former central banker and former chair of trillion-dollar Brookfield Asset Management. My guest, Daniel Westlake, is an assistant professor of political studies from the University of Saskatchewan. He analyzes the competition between the NDP and the Liberals. What next for the NDP? Does the NDP have a future? I spoke with Daniel Westlake on May 1st. Daniel, you saw this developing for many months, and you had a blog, the Somewhere Left of Ottawa blog that you produced back at the end of March under the headline, Consolidation and Fragmentation, the Success of the Liberals in 2025 Depends a Lot on the Weakness of the NDP. And that really was the story of the election on April 28th, that the Liberals were able to attract enough NDP voters to really form power and block the Conservatives from power.
Yeah, so I think we saw in this campaign kind of two things, both that happened before the election was called, that really mattered. One was the resignation of Justin Trudeau and his replacement with Mark Carney. I think across the board, because Trudeau was unpopular, that helped pull some votes to the Liberals. And then the big thing that I think affects the New Democrats is the election of Donald Trump and the subsequent tariffs and 51st state threats. And it was those particular moments where NDP support collapsed. And then nothing really moved after that. And my kind of instinct from that is that it was this threat from the United States, this question of who do you want respond to that threat, that moved a lot of voters from the NDP over to the Liberals. The problem for the NDP in this election is, if the main question is who do you want to deal with the United States and Donald Trump, well, the answer to that question is not Jagmeet Singh, just because you know Jagmeet Singh's not going to be the prime minister. And in that kind of context, I mean, it was very, very difficult for the NDP to get attention paid to its issues. The English leaders debate, I think, becomes an important metaphor here. You saw the number of times Singh was interrupting. To me, that's an indication or a metaphor for a campaign in which the NDP really had to fight to get attention paid to it, and often would lose that battle to try to get attention paid to the issues that were important to it.
Contradiction in many ways that Mark Carney, former Bank of Canada governor, former Bank of England governor, who became the chair of Brookfield Asset Management, which has $1 trillion worth of assets, heavily involved in real estate, heavily involved also in other investments around the world, including private healthcare. Yet NDP voters decided to put their vote with Mark Carney's candidates instead of Pierre Poilievre's candidates. Is this just an anomaly, or do you think that the NDP itself has given voters a reason to rethink their priorities?
Yeah, so I think this may be some of the good news coming out of the election for the NDP, or the reasons to be optimistic, in that this was a Liberal Party. I think you mentioned the biography of Carney, but also, I mean, the first two things he does after becoming Prime Minister is get rid of the carbon tax and cut a corporate tax increase. These are not the kind of things that pull left-leaning voters over to a party. And indeed, I think are indications that the Liberal Party has shifted right and left space on the left for a party like the NDP to be successful. And so the good news there is that points to something that's idiosyncratic to this election hurting the NDP. If the NDP and Canadian politics can get beyond dealing with Trump, the United States, all of that stuff, maybe those left-wing voters go back to the New Democrats. And that's a good reason to be optimistic. The reason to be pessimistic is that you've got, they've lost official party status and you lose resources as a result. The Poilievre threat is there. I don't want to diminish it. In places like Windsor, the NDP probably lost some votes to the Conservatives. But I think the Liberal threat is larger. I think it's certainly the case that you're going to have some unionized voters in the private sector and, say, the construction industry shifting over to the Conservatives. But if we look at where the NDP is successful in the last couple of elections, it's in places like British Columbia, it's in quite progressive places. And so I think the Liberals are the greater threat in those kinds of ridings, even if the NDP is losing some support to the Conservatives.
You know, the NDP has traditionally been the Labour Party of Canada. Of course, it is also very active in social causes, and it's the party that's always been synonymous with healthcare. But does it have to rebrand? What does it have to do to return to its roots at the same time as look forward?
Yeah, so I think it depends where the NDP wants to go. I think going back to where they were in 2021 or in 2019 is fairly straightforward. So I haven't seen the data for this election, but if I go back and look at really everything from 2008 forward to 2021, the NDP still does better with unionized voters, and they still do better than lower income voters. Where they struggle is, say, amongst unionized voters who don't have university degrees, who have college degrees, or who are working in the construction sector. And then on non-economic issues, it's not clear that they have an advantage over the Liberals. So if I think about an NDP base, it's people who are quite economically left-leaning. It's people who are members of unions, perhaps public sector unions, and people who might be making lower incomes. The Conservatives, I think, have a base. If you have, say, a college education working in the resource sector and either aren't unionized or don't have a university degree, that's where they can start to pick up voters. And then the Liberals, I think, have substantial levels of support with those who have university educations, with those who are socially progressive, not as economically left-leaning as the NDP are. And so this creates a challenge for the NDP. There's that space on the economic left for a party the size that the NDP was in 2019 and 2021. And I think that moves forward. These are people who are working, say, in the nursing sector, people who are in unionized jobs, but aren't making large amounts of money. If they want to get to where they were in 2011, they need these more higher income individuals who are environmentalists, who are socially progressive, who come from immigrant backgrounds. And those voters tend to be with the Liberals. And I'm not sure they can win those voters back. So I think there's space for an NDP the size it was in 2019 and 2021, getting to where it was in 2011. That's a lot more challenging.
Where do you think the party will go, and who do you think could be the kind of person that this party needs at this time?
So I think this is a really challenging thing for the NDP. I think it'll be very difficult to draw somebody out of provincial politics. I mean, it's not surprising that David Eby doesn't want to lead this party. I mean, he's premier of a province and has a lot of policy influence right now. It's not clear what the path to that kind of influence at the federal level is. And I'd say the same thing goes for Rob Canoe. He might be very attractive to the federal NDP. I'm not quite sure that the leader of the federal NDP is necessarily a job that's attractive to him. He can do a lot on healthcare, a lot on education as Premier of Manitoba, probably more than he can be as leader of a party that doesn't have official party status. And the other challenge, if you're trying to look for an outsider, somebody that doesn't have a seat, is that they need to find a way into Parliament. And right now, it's not clear. I don't know that any of the current MPs are going to be ready to give up their seat for a new leader. And I don't know what the kind of opening is for a Democratic leader to get into the House of Commons. And so they may have to pull, like in the short term, from one of the MPs that survived. It's probably got to be somebody that speaks French, which could create its own challenges. And so that list of and it's got to be somebody who's willing to take on what's going to be a challenging job, trying to revive a party without a lot of resources to do so. This is a tricky thing for the NDP to do. I mean, I think about options of the people that survived the election. Alexandre Boulalice in Quebec comes to mind. I don't know if he's interested, but if the party wants to revive itself in Quebec, wants somebody who understands Quebec politics, well, there's an option there. And then you've got, I mean, a number of Western Canadian members of Parliament that, I don't know what their interest would be in this particular leadership. For the NDP, the New Democrats in the last couple of elections really needed to be successful in British Columbia. Like that was where they were holding on to a lot of vote. And in this past election, I don't know that at the beginning of the campaign, they paid enough attention to how vulnerable they were. I mean, it's remarkable to see Singh lose by a large margin in Burnaby, as you mentioned, Julian to go down, and then also like the results on Vancouver Island were somewhat shocking. To see the NDP get 25% of the vote in Victoria, like that is not a riding they should be losing by that amount. And so on the strategy side, I think the NDP needs to think about where it is in British Columbia and where the campaign went wrong in trying to hold on to seats in British Columbia.
Do you think that we'd be having a different conversation if Jagmeet Singh had either not entered the confidence and supply agreement with Justin Trudeau and the Liberals, or if they had backed out of that at a time when they could have forced an election and become the opposition party?
So I think the immediate aftermath of 2021, regardless of whether they're in a confidence and supply agreement, I think we probably see a similar dynamic between the parties, where maybe they're negotiating on a bill-by-bill basis over expansion of Medicare, dental care, et cetera, as opposed to having that guaranteed in a confidence and supply agreement. But I think that probably is the direction they were going to go. As we got closer to this election, I mean, yeah, I think the NDP does do better if they're fighting this election against Justin Trudeau in November, when nobody's talking about tariffs and 51st state stuff and that Liberal number is low. I don't know that they necessarily become the official opposition. The Liberals were weak, but they weren't bleeding a lot. Like that's, I mean, the NDP was still kind of running neck and neck with the Liberals. So it's unclear as to whether they become official opposition, but they probably hold on to more seats. I think the real challenge with I think the NDP made some mistakes in the way that they handled the end of the confidence and supply agreement. And I think they could have gone two ways. They could have said, look, we don't want the Conservatives in power. We're in it till the end, and stayed in the confidence and supply agreement. Or they could have stepped out, said, here are the issues, the reasons why we're stepping out, and we'll force an election. The problem with what they did is they said, okay, we're stepping out, we're going to stand up to the Liberals. And then they repeatedly voted with the Liberals on confidence motions. And so they end up sending mixed messages. And so they're not the party that stood up kind of to the Liberals and forced an election and gets to benefit from maybe winning over some voters frustrated with the Liberals. But they also don't get to claim that they played a fundamental role in keeping that party in power to the election, because they said they were dropping out of the coalition. And so those kinds of mixed messages, I think, did get the NDP in trouble over the last kind of 5 or 6 months. And there, I think Singh and the NDP have to kind of look at their own strategy as something that hurt the party.
And the last question is, in the coming days and weeks, do the remaining NDP members try to negotiate official party status? You know, they fell under the 12-seat threshold on election night. They've got 7. But do they negotiate a deal with the Liberals to get the official party status and negotiate another confidence and supply agreement, or even some sort of coalition? Or do you think that they, once bitten, twice shy, they decide, no, not going to do that again?
I think it's hard to see a confidence and supply agreement or a coalition developing from this. In part because the NDP might be a little gun shy from that, given what happened to them in this election, but part because I don't know if the Liberals are interested. Right now, the Liberals are in a situation where they can offer the NDP stuff, but they can also offer the Bloc stuff. And so it might be worth it for the Liberals to spend the next little while playing the NDP and the Bloc off against each other. And I don't know that the Liberals want to be the party that is handing more power to a party that just lost a lot of support, and that the kind of image around that might not be something the Liberals are interested in. The official party status thing is tricky. And here again, I don't know how interested the Liberals are, just because of how transparent it looks as just kind of this move that is designed to benefit both the NDP and the Liberals, that is so clearly in their self-interest, despite the result of the election, that kind of makes it easy for the Conservatives and other voters to say, well, wait a second. This party got a pretty strong rebuke in the polls. Why is it getting this official party status? Why is it getting things that are just clearly set up to benefit it? It's hard to know how you sell that to the electorate. And so the NDP might want that in terms of trying to get, you benefit from the resources. I don't know that that's on the table. And I think it's very tricky to make that argument to the public that this is something that the NDP should have after such a strong rebuke from voters. So it is a really challenging decision for the NDP. And I think the Liberals would have to be really concerned that they might lose a confidence vote to be able to make that kind of offer to the NDP.
Well, thanks again for joining me on the podcast. Daniel Westlake, the Assistant Professor in Political Studies at the University of Saskatchewan.
Thank you for having me.
Desiree Fixler was the Chief Sustainability Officer for a subsidiary of Germany's Deutsche Bank. She blew the whistle on greenwashing at DWS. DWS paid a $25 million settlement to the Securities and Exchange Commission in the United States over greenwashing and anti-money laundering violations. Fixler is on a mission to end 2 ideologies that she says are ruining both Wall Street and Main Street: ESG and DEI. Environmental, social, and governance, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. Fixler says Liberal Prime Minister Mark Carney is the problem, not the solution for Canada. She says that Carney will be no match for U.S. President Donald Trump or China's Xi Jinping. I spoke with Desiree Fixler on May 1st. Have companies changed? Have regulators changed? Have investors changed since you were the whistleblower back in the early 2020s? Are they wiser, and are they doing better to try to stop greenwashing frauds from happening?
So the answer is yes. The DWS, the Deutsche Bank scandal, sent shockwaves through the financial industry. So there is improved disclosure. But what's very troublesome is that corporations today, and also national and local governments, are still clinging on to the concept of ESG and DEI, even though it was shown to be a complete multi-trillion-dollar marketing scam. So it's reduced the exaggeration, right? It certainly has mitigated the greenwashing, But folks in the corporate world are still clinging on to political agendas like net zero, for example. And of course, we have still governments adhering to net zero. So it hasn't stopped the movement, a movement that as a former insider, I know the detriment, the harm it's caused to citizens globally.
Mark Carney won the April 28th election with the Liberal Party. He was sworn in originally as Prime Minister in March and spent about 9 days on the job before calling the snap election. He came into the position with a lot of questions about his past as chair of Brookfield Asset Management. He's also someone who was the United Nations Special Envoy on Climate Action and Finance. He was heavily involved in the UN climate change conference that happened in Glasgow, Scotland. And from that, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. He's been banging the drum for many years about net zero. A lot of people look at net zero and say, that's great. We'd like to decarbonize, like to make a greener, cleaner planet. But the various industries are also complaining that the goals are a little bit too ambitious for us, that we aren't able to get into this fast enough, and it could hurt the economy. Where do you stand on this?
Just look at the UK and Europe. You'll see that GDP per capita productivity is flatlining, or in some large economies like Germany, declining. So what you can expect from a globalist or a Davos agenda aligned person like Mark Carney, someone who led GFANZ, as you rightly said, is you can expect a few things. You can expect, number one, economic decline. You can expect national security weakness. Just look at what happened in Spain and Portugal recently. Energy unreliability, total blackouts. You can expect an explosion on regulation. Everything, red tape and controls on how you're transporting yourself, what you consume, how you're heating your home, how you bank. These are the things that we've seen this ideology, how it's been rolled out in Europe and the UK, because you have leaders aligned to this, to these policies like net zero. And so, but one point I do want to make about Mark Carney, although I'm very critical of, our Prime Minister right now in the UK, Keir Starmer is local. Right. Whether you look at Macron or you look at, the incoming Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, they're local. Mark Carney is different because he has been on the global stage. His hands, he's got tentacles in every aspect of policy making globally. And, as you said previously, he chairs Bloomberg LP, a huge news network. Bloomberg Foundation funding all of these wokery organizations and net zero policies. He was part of Brookfield, PIMCO, huge, in charge of trillions of dollars of assets on so many, leading university boards. In addition to, of course, sitting on multi-lats and NGOs and think tanks, as you mentioned, the UN and something like GFANZ. So Mark Carney is, for me, is a much more formidable and I think sinister leader because of his global reach that he has, unlike similar eco-socialist aligned leaders in Europe. And if you just look at the economic data and the hardship coming out of the continent in the UK, that's what you can expect in Canada.
One of the first people internationally to congratulate Mark Carney on social media was Michael Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York. The chair of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero is Michael Bloomberg. Michael Bloomberg also co-chairs what's called the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, and their ambassador is the former mayor of Vancouver, Gregor Robertson, who was elected as one of the star candidates for Mark Carney's Liberal Party on April 28th. And Gregor Robertson, back when he was mayor of Vancouver from 2008 to 2018, was heavily involved in a group called C40 Cities. And lo and behold, the president of that board is Michael Bloomberg himself. Why should people be concerned about Michael Bloomberg and his connection?
Because of Michael Bloomberg's power. It's similar to, look at other prominent billionaires that are, like left-leaning and very politically active. Power and money. Look, I'm a New Yorker. Bloomberg was a good mayor. And let's just assume that Carney and Bloomberg had good intentions at the beginning of this ESG movement of net zero. The problem that I have with these two individuals, Carney and Bloomberg, is that a few years into the movement, right, when I started to whistleblow, the economic data was coming in. These climate policies that Bloomberg and Carney were pushing, they're driving up energy prices. They created an affordability crisis. If you ask any voter on recent elections, what's the top priority? It's generally speaking globally, what will come out is the economy. I know that in Canada recently, one issue was, of course, the threat from America was, Trump's threat to annex Canada, which of course is like, far from, going to happen. But I understand that was a concern. But I understood that generally speaking, it was the economy, right? That was the previous to Trump's statements, it was the economy that was driving things. And that's the problem I have with the Bloomberg and Carney, is that they saw this economic data coming in that, shareholders, investors, citizens were struggling with the stranglehold of these net zero policies. And that's when I turned to say, wait, hang on a second. You guys are saying, and I was, again, I traveled in Mark Carney's circles, right? I was there. I was part of the World Economic Forum, part of the GFANS movement. And you're saying like, whoa, hold on a second. You're not saving the planet and the people. Number one, actually, there is no climate emergency. There just is no climate emergency. There is, however, an affordability emergency. There is like a geopolitical emergency. There's the threat of like nuclear war, right? There's, a demographic emergency, low birth rates. But climate? No, there is no climate crisis. And it was something that, what I clocked is that, it was like a holy shit moment. Like, these folks are fear mongering. They are drumming up a fake crisis in order to make money off of it and to control. And they're just denying the economic data, that the red tape is strangling businesses. Look at all the farmer protests, right? And the trucker protests. I know that was on the COVID issue, but you have citizens, standing up and speaking out. And these WEF, World Economic Forum individuals, and I put Carney in that pile, that was the crazy thing. They pretend to, be about the people, and they do just the opposite. They're so detached from the plight of ordinary citizens, they just dismiss it. And so what is scary is the power that they have. And your question, of course, is about Bloomberg. That is Bloomberg News, like all of Wall Street. And I use the term Wall Street to talk about the financial industry globally, right? That is the main news source. Like every trader just has Bloomberg headlines, right? Yes, your main news feed. That's in fact your lifeline. You do everything on Bloomberg. Right. And now you've got this GFANS, this net zero connection, and this promotion of a fake climate crisis. It's a climate hoax. And everyone's jumping on board net zero. But ordinary citizens, they're not stupid. They're really smart. They're looking at their monthly electricity bills going like, the renewable energy isn't cheaper. It's more expensive. And now, and again, everyone was talking about the risks of being dependent on intermittent energy sources. And we've seen what's happened to the collapse of the grid in, the Iberian Peninsula that even fed into France. And that's the thing. Both individuals, Bloomberg and Carney, just deny economic data and market data and citizen protests. They just denied, shut it down, shut it off. And that's very scary.
Now, in the coming days, Mark Carney is expected to travel to the White House to meet with Donald Trump to talk about the tariffs issue. But really the elephant in the room in all this is Xi Jinping over in China. China is backing Russia in the war in Ukraine. There's the alliance, the BRICS economic and geopolitical alliance. There is work that they're also doing with Iran.
Mark Carney, while he has been on the global stage, there's no doubt, he has tremendous global reach and experience. What I would say is that he is no match for the US or China. And whatever is happening, whatever backdoor deals he's negotiated with Brookfield and China, I'm not privy to. So I really can't speak about that. But, look, I voted for Donald Trump. And I don't know, ultimately it's still early in the administration, how things are going to, fall out or what the outcomes are going to be on Trump's tariff push. But of course, we know that Americans and Canadians are friends. We're not enemies. That's just not going to happen. And a lot of the concerns that, Canadians are expressing, particularly, folks in, British Columbia, Alberta and Saskatchewan are the issues, like on the reason why I voted for Donald Trump. It's about the affordability crisis, drill baby drill. Let's use our natural resources. Let's innovate. Let's have prosperity. Let's get rid of this crazy DEI wokery. Let's go back to common sense and meritocracy. And so, a lot of Canadians and Americans share, have that alignment. Look, I think Trump is playing. And I think, again, he referred to Trudeau as a governor, right? Carney is like 10 times worse than Trudeau for his ideology. How is that going to go down? And look, you guys have Bill C-69. That's a benefit to America. So I don't know, I'm just guessing here, but look, a Carney win was beneficial to America because it prevents further pipeline builds and the export of your gas. And we keep getting your, discounted gas. That's a good thing. A conservative government would likely have, put America in competition and expanded, pipelines and expanded your export and would have drilled more and you would have benefited from natural resources. But, with Carney, you have a cap on it. And so ultimately, I don't know how it's going to pan out, but Trump is definitely looking to get a better deal, right? Make more money from Canada. There's no doubt. He's not looking I'm just going to say it. He's not looking to help Canada. And I don't think that Carney is any match. Carney is more of a bureaucrat, a technocrat. Trump and what is said coming out of China and the US, sometimes is bluster, right? In order to get a better deal, right? The art of, the deal. I think Trump calls it, the golden rule, he who has the gold makes the rules. And I just don't see Carney being prepared for that. Carney is much more aligned with Europe. Ursula von der Leyen, Macron, the incoming Chancellor Merz, Keir Starmer here in the UK. And, even if trade ties are strengthened between Canada and Europe and the UK, those economies are spiraling, right? It's like, what help is that? So, it's a wait and see. I can't give more insight into that. We have to see how things play out. But I don't think Carney is any match for Trump or, running to Europe. Europe is not going to help. Ursula von der Leyen is not going to be a help here.
To finish off, who profits from net zero?
Brookfield, as an example, the asset management industry, I mean, all service providers, it's a feeding frenzy. It is a multi-trillion-dollar industrial complex. So while Brookfield will still finance, fossil fuel businesses, they now have a huge new market called like the transition market, just a fake name for the climate hoax. And so there are all these like feeding frenzy on, new businesses like green hydrogen and the proliferation of other, of renewables, battery storage. I mean, I'm not saying that we shouldn't always seek cheaper forms of energy. I think we always should. But this is just trillions of dollars being piled into unprofitable businesses or into companies that make no difference. But ESG, sustainable investing, was a marketing scam because it was a means to overcharge for underperforming. You could now say you're saving the planet and folks pay extra. There's a green premium. So, the asset management industry like Brookfield, banks, law firms, the consultant, the big consultant firms like McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group, data providers like Bloomberg, news providers like Bloomberg, right? Made out like a bandit here. It was just a whole growth market, and you were pulling at people's on the heartstrings, right? You were saying that you were offering great investment products that provided great financial returns plus social and environmental positive impact. It did nothing of the like. There was no impact. The only thing that happened is that investors were fleeced. That was it.
Well, thanks again for joining me on the podcast. Desiree Fixler joining me from London.
Thank you.
Now it's time on the theBreaker.news podcast for Around the Rim. We look at news headlines around the Pacific Rim. In FocusTaiwan.tw, Canadian think tank urges Ottawa to unambiguously support Taiwan. The Macdonald-Laurier Institute emphasized that Taiwan meets all the criteria for statehood under the 1933 Montevideo Treaty that defines a state as having a permanent population, defined territory, government, and capacity to enter into relations with other states. The MLI said China's legal strategy, described as international lawfare, is designed to prevent the United Nations from supporting Taiwan in the event of conflict, as it did with Ukraine following the 2022 Russian invasion. In Kyoto news, Japan's JERA pledges stable power supply by using LNG-fired plant. One of the world's largest power plants fueled by liquefied natural gas, Kawago Thermal Power Station, has a maximum output of 4.8 million kilowatts. In Hong Kong Free Press, systems failure at M&S Hong Kong stores continues amid UK ransomware attack. Staff at some Marks & Spencer stores in Hong Kong have been using pen and paper to process details of orders. According to the BBC, a loosely run group called Scattered Spider is using malicious software from a gang called Dragon Force. That's Around the Rim on this edition of the theBreaker.news podcast. Now it's time on the theBreaker.news podcast for Cascadia Calling. We look at news headlines around the Pacific Northwest. In Willamette Week, TLC's Oregon-based Poly family lacks the drama reality TV fans crave. Out-of-left-field drama seems unlikely from a group hinging on transparent communication and a regimented schedule. The latest Rubbernecker focuses on Alicia and Tyler, married 11 years, and Taya and Sean, married 6 years. Alicia dates Sean and Taya dates Tyler, while each couple maintains their marriages. Together, they raise 4 children, with 1 more on the way. This polyamorous arrangement is known as a closed quad. In the Washington State Standard, electricity demand in Northwest could double in the next 20 years, forecast finds. Data centers, electrifying transit and buildings, and producing hydrogen will drive demand, according to the Northwest Power and Conservation Council. The projected growth will come primarily from companies building more data centers in the region, more electric vehicles on roads, electrifying buildings, computer chip manufacturing, and the production of green hydrogen created by running an electrical current through water to split the molecules into hydrogen and oxygen. And check out theBreaker.news and bobmackin.substack.com for the stories behind these headlines. Exclusive, ominous warning from Vancouver City Hall about vehicle ramming attacks at public events. And when they were in power, they were too busy for Mark Carney's real estate warning. Now they're riding his coattails. Read the stories behind these headlines. Go to theBreaker.news and bobmackin.substack.com. That's Cascadia calling on this edition of the Breaker.news podcast.
Don't matter what color you are, 'cause love will conquer hate, so you won't stand alone, you won't stand alone.
The virtual Nanaimo Bar, brought to you by Spruce Hill Contracting. Every week we end the Breaker.news podcast on a tasty note by awarding the goodness of a virtual Nanaimo bar to people making a difference. A virtual version of the province's favorite dessert bar goes this week to the first responders, the doctors, the nurses, the medical technicians, the Good Samaritans, the neighbors, the local businesses, and the service organizations and charities. Everyone in the community who did their part, big or small, to help when tragedy struck the Lapu Day Filipino Block Party on April 26th in Vancouver. And please say a prayer for the 11 victims and their loved ones. Jennifer Darbelay, Glitza Daniela Samper, Glitza Maria Caicedo, Daniel Samper, Richard Lee, Lynn Huang, Katie Lee, Kira Salim, Jende May Siko, Maria Victoria Bjarnason, and Narissa Pagkinlungen. April 26, 2025, the darkest day in Vancouver history since the second Narrows Bridge collapsed in 1958. And you can nominate someone for a virtual Nanaimo bar. Send me an email to bob@theBreaker.news. That's it for the Breaker.news podcast for the week of May 4th, 2025. I'm Bob Mackin. Thanks for joining me. Did you know that on the 4th of May in 1972, Vancouver's Don't Make a Wave Committee changed its name to Greenpeace? Now you know. Send me your feedback. Send me your story ideas to bob@theBreaker.news. Bookmark theBreaker.news. You can also find us at theBreaker.ca. And introducing bobmackin.substack.com. Visit me there too. Sign up for the free email newsletter and get updates to your inbox. Or follow The Breaker News as news happens on X, formerly Twitter. And you can support The Breaker for as little as $7 a month. For more information, go to bobmackin.substack.com. Until next week.